This video contains spoilers and assumes you have finished the game at least once.
Turn back now, ye tarnished, lest ye be spoiled. Ugh.
This is part 2 of the Mysteries of Mohg. Go check out the first part if you haven't, but let's get straight into this. Mohg's cult to the Formless Mother was far-reaching, and he built it in some very different but very interesting ways. First, we must mention the most important member of Mohg's entourage, Varé. I did a whole video on him already, which I recommend you watch if you are interested in his history. The important things you need to know is that Varé was the only one to tame the Accursed Blood, he was likely Mohg's main recruiter, and that he and the other war surgeons were kidnapped. Since that video, it's also been pointed out to me that I may have slightly overthought some aspects of it, and that he and the other war surgeons were likely just medics during the shattering. It's possible they were involved in grafting, but it's likely that wasn't what they did for the most part. The battles they saw were so brutal that they were forced to mercy kill the very knights that they were hoping to save. Evidence of this is in the item description of Misericorde, which can be found in Stormveil Castle. This item reads, "Dagger favoured by military physicians in white. The pointed blade is hard and sharp, making critical hits especially potent. Medicine is mercy, and mercy upon the battlefield is ruthless. Beware the killers clothed as men of compassion." Because this item was found in Stormveil, it is likely at least some were indeed grafting. However, it is also important to point out that this dagger's name literally means mercy in Latin, and mercy killing is exactly what it was used for. Whether they were grafting or simply mercy killing, they saw a lot of blood, and this is why Mohg kidnapped them. It's also important to mention once more that only Varé was able to tame the Accursed Blood, which leads me to believe that the bloodlust and insanity we see in other Bloody Fingers is a byproduct of Mohg's outer god-touched Accursed Blood. He is simply the only Bloody Finger or war surgeon we can have a conversation with, and due to this, he's likely Mohg's main recruiter. The big question is then, who was the first to join Mohg? It is unlikely to be Varé, but we do have a rather likely possibility. In the subterranean shunning grounds, we can find Esgar, Priest of Blood, and 2 blood-rotting dogs. He seemingly remains to spread the word and blessings of Mohg to others in the shunning grounds, or perhaps to venerate this place that is so sacred to his bloody religion. He likely would have joined Mohg before Mohg left to go claim the section of the dead civilization that became his dynasty's spawning grounds. Quick aside, as some commenters have pointed out, the architecture of the Mohgwyn dynasty is more like the Ul Palace ruins rather than Nokron, despite it being quite close geographically to Nokron. This could suggest that the dead civilization is even older and more lost than our first assessment, but I digress. Besides Varé, we also meet several Bloody Fingers across the lands between, the first being Bloody Finger Neregus. When fighting Neregus, we can be assisted by Bloody Finger Hunter Yura. This encounter gives us a good first insight into the Bloody Fingers. Firstly, let's talk about Reduvia, the dagger Neregus drops. It reads, "Jagged dagger with a distinctive curled blade. Carried by the noble servants of the Lord of Blood, this dagger rips the flesh as it enters, inflicting blood loss with sickening efficacy. A proud testament to the success of its vicious design, this weapon is perpetually coated in blood." Neregus is already considered a noble servant, but also this item mentions servants, plural. There are more like Neregus, who also carry weapons much like Reduvia. Yura mentions that the Bloody Fingers were once tarnished, held thrall by Cessblood, and we can in fact join them through Varé's questline, which also suggests that many of the other Bloody Fingers were inducted by Varé as well. But even more curiously, there are other Bloody Fingers that we can fight, and a disproportionate number of them come from one specific place. The Land of Reeds exists far away from the lands between, and there is very little we know about it. The altered Lands of Reed armor is one of the few items that gives us any insight. It reads, "Armor made from strips of iron fastened together, worn by warriors of the Lands of Reeds. The Land of Reeds has long been locked in a miserable civil war, during which time it has remained alienated from the cultures of its neighbours. Little wonder that the entire nation has succumbed to blood-soaked madness, or so it is said." Yura talks often of a Bloody Finger named Eleonora, once a noble knight, now only a zealot of Cessblood. We can fight her in the Second Church of Marika, and she drops a few items. First, the Purifying Crystal Tear, which cleanses the curse of the Lord of Blood, allowing us to survive his deadly Nihil. and secondly, her pole blade. It reads, Twin Naginata, forged in the land of reeds, chosen weapon of Eleonora, violent, bloody finger. Her mastery of the sword was such that her onslaught was likened to a whirlwind, but now her legacy is stained by accursed blood. She was seemingly a knight who fought during the civil war in the land of reeds, before leaving and ruining her legacy by succumbing to the call of accursed blood. What is perhaps most terrifying is that she uses dragon incantations. This could indeed suggest that not only has she killed dragons, but she's familiar with the dragon altars that we can use as well. Alongside this, it's obvious she's worthy of carrying the crystal tear, which Mohg likely entrusted to her for safekeeping as one of his strongest bloody fingers. She is not the only bloody finger from the land of reeds. In the mountaintop of giants, we can be invaded by Okina. After his death, he drops the Okina mask, which reads, a wooden mask that depicts an old man baring his teeth, the source of the sobriquet of the great swordsman of the land of reeds. Raises dexterity as it lowers focus. The more he sharpened his mind, the more the absurdities of the world came into stark relief. And so, Okina renounced it all and rose to a higher plane. There was only himself, his katana, and its mastery. Before long, Okina became a demon of a swordsman. Okina was faced with a world gone mad in bloodshed, a land where death was a commonality and chaos was all that remained. His response was to renounce his teachings, his disciples, and finally give in to the madness and blood. The white reed armor of his disciples reads, armor of the white reeds, fashioned from banded iron plates, worn by the Inaba head disciples of the great swordsman Okina. The Inaba traveled in pursuit of not only the master who abandoned them, but also proper deaths, won honorably through hard-fought combat. To be a white reed is to seek death, fitting for the Inaba, who desired nothing more than to die by the sword. With nothing left for them in the land of reeds, the Inaba did their best to follow Okina's bloody path, and it's likely none found him. But they did find what they were looking for, death and blood, hand in hand, once again. Okina's katana can be obtained by defeating him. In fact, it's one of the most used katanas in the game. The Rivers of Blood. It reads, weapon of Okina, swordsman from the land of reeds, a cursed weapon that has felled countless men. When Mohg, the Lord of Blood, first felt Okina's sword and madness upon his flesh, he had a proposal to offer Okina the life of a demon whose thirst would never go unsated. Not only did Okina do battle with Mohg, Mohg was impressed enough that he gave Okina the power of a bloody finger. Okina gave in fully to Mohg and his accursed blood, but it is obvious that this madness and need for blood likely surpassed his love for his lord. But perhaps the most concerning thought of all is that the bloody fingers alone were not the only followers of Mohg. The sanguine nobles around the lands between and in the Mohgwyn dynasty all use the bloody Hellis rapier and take on an appearance much like Mohg himself. Their outfit reads, the grand metallic pattern on the shoulder is a signifier of the noble rank that they intend to claim upon the advent of the new dynasty that they are working to install. And their hood reads, hood of dyed black cloth featuring gold embroidery, worn by the nobles who serve the Lord of Blood. Known to strike from pools of blood, these assassins are missionaries come to share the gospel of accursed blood. This much is true. They do indeed sprout from pools of blood, and Mohg himself is seen sprouting from a pool of blood in his cutscene. In fact, when we invade another Tarnished, we also sprout from a pool of blood. Mohg gives his followers many powerful blood-tied blessings, some of which come from his blood and some come from our own. The bloodied finger is a gift given to us by Vare, and it is very obviously Mohg's accursed blood being transplanted into us and giving us his strength. In this case, the ability to invade through pools of blood. Speaking of bloody fingers, it is also interesting to note that Mohg has an odd finger. His middle finger on his left hand seems to be a long, gnarled horn, which could actually be where the process of bloody fingers started in the first place. Perhaps some of the first to join Mohg wished to emulate their master more, and accepted accursed blood through a finger for that very reason. But this isn't the only place the sanguine nobles have been changed. They very obviously have grown blackened horns across their body, and putting on their set does not give you these horns, so they seem organic to the beings that we are fighting. This could suggest that prolonged exposure also gives Mohg's followers a form of the Omen curse. Perhaps that could even be an end game for Mohg, much like
The loathsome Dung Eater.
He wishes for a world where all were blessed to be an omen. But this poses a puzzling question. Vare, who loved Mohg so much and was seemingly his most devout follower, has no visible horns. Could this be another perk of having tamed the accursed blood, or did Mohg not care about him as much as he thought? But Mohg's cult doesn't even end there. He has hordes of beings that were likely once human. These bloody animated corpses live to do three things: shamble around, pray to Mohg, or run at the Tarnish and explode in bloody glory. Even stranger are the red blood Albinaurics. They seem to follow Mohg now, going as far as to even watch over or keep imprisoned the other more classic grey Albinauric species. They seem to be growing horns atop their head as well. However, these horns are much smaller than all of the others that we see. Mohg has all of these followers, yet they are all so spread out, some seemingly insane with no clear reason for what they're doing. That is, until we kill Esgar in the Shunning Grounds and obtain the Lord of Blood's exaltation. The item description is the final piece to why Mohg needed a cult, and it reads: a talisman depicting the exaltation of the Lord of Blood. Raises attack power when blood loss occurs in the vicinity. Render up your offerings of blood to your lord. Drench my consort's chamber. Slake his cocoon's thirst. His awakening shall herald the dawn of our dynasty. Esgar and the other bloody fingers were originally spilling the blood of the Tarnished and the others that they were fighting in order to offer blood to the cocoon of Miquella the Unalloyed. The Formless Mother likely needed more blood in order to claim Miquella as her vessel. Their bloodlust and madness was not only sated, but it was all for a very worthy cause. Speaking of a world drenched in blood, it may be important to consider what a world like that would even be like. Would it be a good thing for the lands between? Well, all signs lead very distinctly to no. We should start first with the Sea of Blood, or Marsh of Blood, as that's a little bit more accurate. It's very obvious straight off the bat, blood pools would cover the land if Mohg was given the chance to extend his empire. The best example of this is the Rose Church. It is filled to the brim with blood and bulbous masses. As part of these seas or marshes, we also do indeed get geysers of blood. Much like the rot geysers, these would be toxic to most life forms and change them irreparably, which we do indeed see. It's also important to note the bulbous masses I mentioned earlier. They look like they're made from flesh growing without limit, almost like a cancer. In fact, we can even see these on the wildlife in the blood-touched areas. In the Mohgwyn dynasty, we can see a variety of the Caelid crows, except this subspecies appears to have those writhing masses growing across their body and faces. They also gain an attack where they writhe around, which is quite a pain to deal with. Alongside them, we can also encounter blood-rotting dogs, again with the same masses on them, albeit a lot smaller. They also have a highly aggressive writhe attack, one which in earlier patches dealt 11,640 damage before blood loss is taken into account. These dogs can also be found with Esgar, lending to the thought that they would be tamed by other priests of blood for use in bloodletting. One creature we don't see, however, is the Tyrannodogs. This is odd considering that the Mohgwyn dynasty is directly under Caelid, and two of the other common species are found down here as well. It seems somewhat strange that they are missing. But strangest of all, some of the bulbous masses I mentioned earlier have come to life in the form of bloody slimes. Finally, from all of these beasts we can find blood-tainted excrement, which reads, the bloody excrement of a carnivorous beast. Material used for crafting items, found in the land of the new dynasty. Mixed inside with half-digested flesh are dense colonies of tiny eggs of unknown but assuredly revolting origin. Both of the creatures I mentioned earlier, primarily the dogs and the crows, could easily be the producer of this excrement, considering they are both rather obviously carnivorous. That by itself lends to a rather terrifying view of what a blood-soaked world would look like. The trees down here are bare of leaves, whether it is due to being underground or due to the bloody swamp giving little nutrients, which would mean that the majority of beings down here would need to be carnivorous, surviving either eating others or feasting on accursed blood, and in the end, their excrement would be used as a spawning grounds for something even worse. The roped flypot and swarm pot both give an insight into what this could be. They read, craftable item prepared using a cracked pot. A cocktail of effluence is sealed inside. Throw at enemies to set a swarm of blood flies upon them. The vile swarm deals damage and builds up onset of blood loss. The cacophony of their wings assail the sanity of berserkers. The maggots found in waste feed on blood and turn into vicious blood flies that are pitiably short-lived. The Swarm of Flies incantation gives a similar insight. A Blood Oath incantation, shared from the Lord of Blood's power, release a swarm of blood flies before the caster to assault foes. The vile swarm deals damage and builds up onset of blood loss. The new palace of the Lord of Blood lies in a swamp of festering blood, and these flies are said to spawn from excrement in that land. The festering swamp creates blood-tainted excrement that spawns hungry blood flies. I'm sure I don't need to tell you how terrifying it would be to be assailed by flies like this. Especially flies spawned from excrement, hungry for blood. A world filled with these bugs would be horrendous. There is, however, some beauty to be found around the blood. The iconic blood rose is found in every spot where accursed blood is seen. In fact, even Vare uses a bouquet of them as his weapon. This also gives us a very obvious way of telling where the Lord of Blood's influence has reached in the overworld. One odd place stands out. Fort Hate has a soldier of Godric who seemingly went rogue and took it for himself. He uses the bloody slash art of war, and this is where we can get it. This shows again the insane amount of influence that Mohg has over others. He was even able to convert another soldier from under a different banner to his cause. Lastly, we also find Albinaurics. It seems likely that they were chasing Miquella, as we can find them next to a portal leading from the consecrated snowfield to the Mohgwyn dynasty. Once they reach the Mohgwyn dynasty, some are corrupted, some captured, and eventually it seems that they sit in the blood and become blood Albinaurics, growing horns much like their new master. The many instances of horns we see across the game seem very separate, but in truth they may very well be connected. Firstly, we need to mention the aspect of the Crucible Horns incantation, which reads, one of the ancient Erdtree incantations creates a mighty horn on the caster's shoulder to gore foes from a low stance. Charging allows the caster to barrel into foes before delivering the final attack. This is a manifestation of the Erdtree's primal vital energies, aspect of the primordial crucible where all life was once blended together. This directly points at horns being a product of the Crucible. This also lends to the idea that it is a manifestation of the original Erdtree or Great Tree. Also looking more closely at Mohg, we can see that one of his horns is piercing his left eye. This is something that can occur in real life in goats and boars. Perhaps when Mohg had his epiphany in the Cathedral of the Forsaken, it was because he became blinded, and as you may remember, the Briars mentioned that seeing the Blood Star required you to be blinded. In fact, it seems blindness and connections to outer gods is a trend throughout Elden Ring, between Melania being blind and connected to an outer god of rot, and Hyetta/Arena being blind and connected to the Frenzied Flame. In fact, even Shabriri grapes are literally eyes. It seems necessary that in order to gain access to otherworldly beings and commune with them, you need to lose your worldly sight. It is also interesting to note that Morgott does not have horns on this side of his face. It seems likely that Morgott, earlier in life, cut the horns on that side of his face either to appeal to his parents or perhaps out of shame. In fact, this could also explain some of the seeming madness of Mohg. He literally has a horn piercing or perhaps touching his brain through his eye socket. He could have been functionally lobotomized. Continuing our trend of horns, between a few separate items, we can perhaps see what was originally intended for these horns. Firstly, with the budding horn crafting item, which reads, a rarely seen specimen of a young budding horn. Found by hunting for herbivorous beasts, this horn began to spout on a beast that typically bears no horn. Perhaps it's a vestige of the primordial crucible. This is an instance of the crucible creating horns on people or beasts, but there are even more instances of this in the game. The stalwart, clarifying and immunizing horn charms read, an accoutrement worn by the ancestral followers. Said to be a budding horn, the ancestral followers believe that the horns of a long-lived beast continue to bud like antlers over and over again, until the beast one day becomes an ancestral spirit, continually growing horns. This could either suggest that the Omen Curse could eventually turn creatures into ancestral spirits, or perhaps that the Omen Curse is a bastardized version of this blessing. The blessing becomes a curse when used upon a humanoid, rather than a beast. Looking at the ancestral spirit horn could suggest an even greater connection. It reads, item cut from the horns of the regal ancestor spirit. A number of new growths bud from the antler-like horns of the fallen king, each glowing with light. Thus does new life grow from death, and from death one obtains power. Constantly we have a trend of death and life being hand in hand. And with this, I'd also like to point out an alternative version of the Formless Mother and the Deathbird theory. As we saw in part 1, the twin bird kite shield has 2 birds on it, one more orange and red and the other more black. This could indicate that the twin gods commanded life and death. In a lot of real life cultures, life is indicated by blood and fire, and in Elden Ring it seems very much the same. With this context, it seems just as likely that the Formless Mother, rather than being the Deathbird god, is instead a twin of the Deathbird god. Considering also that Mohg himself is a twin, the parallels are indeed there. A duality of life and death, blood and fire. Twins are seen many places throughout this game. As for the Blood Star, I have one final theory for what it could be: crystallized blood. The Staff of the Guilty reads, a heretical staff fashioned from a smouldering, withered sapling that turns the blood of sacrifices pierced by it into glintstone, similar to hex magic. Consider the concept of a giant red blood glintstone in space. Or perhaps a little bit more likely, that when an eye is pierced and gouged out, it is replaced by their blood becoming crystallized into a red glintstone inside the eye socket. This would also allow communion with the Formless Mother, because, well, she literally lives in your head. This could be why Mohg felt so indebted to her. Communing with her may have literally stopped his horn from killing him by piercing his brain fully. In the game Bloodborne, there is an otherworldly being called the Formless Edon, and there is a very distinct chance that this being is heavily connected to the Formless Mother. Sadly, I myself am not hugely knowledgeable on Bloodborne, as I have not yet had a chance to play it yet. Bring Bloodborne to PC! The only text that I could find for it reads, the Great One Edon, lacking form, exists only in voice, and is symbolized by this rune. Human or no, the oozing blood is a medium of the highest grade, and the essence of the formless Great One. Both Edon and his inadvertent worshippers surreptitiously seek the precious blood. From what I can tell, the Formless Edon is indeed a literal parallel to the Formless Mother. I think it's very likely that FromSoft took the concept from Bloodborne and decided to develop it more in Elden Ring. There are simply far too many similarities, and the main thing to take away from this is that the idea of the Formless Mother is likely not a being that lives in blood, but potentially the metaphorical representation of blood itself. If that were true, then the Blood Star wouldn't even need to be a literal star or a glintstone, but instead simply blood being the only thing left in your eye socket after your eye is gouged out. It is also extremely interesting that the Formless Edon and Mother both cause madness and bloodlust with their influence. Something even more terrifying to note is the possible roots for the word Edon. One possibility is the word Oedipism. It means self-enucleation, or to cut one's own eye out. It is based on Oedipus and how he carved his own eyes out with the brooch of his mother wife. That's a whole nother story. This is also why I've been saying Edon and not something else. With the horn that took Mohg's left eye taken into account, this begins to push the concept that the formless beings are the same. The other main route could be the god Odin, the Norse Allfather, an all-seeing being who uses ravens as scouts. But most importantly, Odin took his own eye and sacrificed it to Mimir's well in order to gain his wisdom. This obviously has parallels to Mohg, losing an eye for wisdom. The final thing perhaps to point out is the possible connection to Marika. The symbol of the Formless Edon has Marika's symbol within it. It could suggest a possibility that Marika, or even part of her, has been the Formless Mother this entire time. With some of the concepts about Radagon and their duality, there's a distinct possibility she's been forced to use a new medium in order to connect to others across the lands between. This would add a far more literal meaning to the name Formless Mother, considering Marika is literally Mohg's mother. We should, however, take all of these with a grain of salt, as all of this is concepts from a completely different game, even if it is a game made by FromSoft. Despite the allure of connections between the games, speculation based on multiple games may lead us astray, even if it is fascinating. Returning to a world drenched in blood, there are indeed some upsides to what Mohg intends. Fresh beast blood is a crafting material you may come across. It reads, fresh beast blood glinting with gold, found by hunting carnivorous beasts. This glimmering blood never rots or decays. The fact that this blood does not rot or decay leads me to believe that mastering blood is one path to defeat the threat of scarlet rot and the outer god of rot as a whole. At the start of her cutscene, Melania says,
My flesh was dull gold, and my blood rotted.
By the end of her fight, she even becomes the goddess of rot herself. Yet a beast's blood does not rot. It's quite curious. On the other side of things, as a player tarnished, one of the easiest ways to cleanse rot is with the Flame Cleanse Me incantation. The incantation reads, one of the incantations of the fire monks creates a fire within that burns away toxins, alleviates poison and scarlet rot buildup, and cures these ailments. This incantation leaves the caster with subtle burns, a reminder that they must fear the flame. On a first read, you may believe that the caster themselves should fear the flame. However, I believe this has a double meaning. Scarlet rot should fear the flame, as it will be burnt away. The same could potentially be said for blood flame burning rot away. Furthermore, the Mohgwyn dynasty is directly under Radahn's arena in Caelid. Caelid is one of the most rot-stricken areas in the Lands Between. Some people have even likened it to Rot Chernobyl. Radahn's arena especially has seen plenty of blood flow for all of those countless beings attempting to put him to an end in his festival, but failing at the last step. The blood sea, or marsh, of the Mohgwyn dynasty is likely the rotting blood of those who died above, seeping down. And yet, somehow, the Mohgwyn dynasty has no rot. What it does have is heaps of accursed blood and a smattering of flame. But then theoretically any flame could be an answer to rot, and that does seem somewhat true. At the very least, the frenzied flame would be a perfect answer to rot, but it would mean cleansing everything. No other flame in the game could answer to rot and also make use of what remains in the same way that blood flame does. We know that the beasts of Caelid can become blood frenzied, and we know that the blood below is not rot stricken. There's no reason to not push this concept a little bit further and conceptualize that the once rotting beings would be able to fuel the seas of blood across the world if the Mohgwyn dynasty spread. Given time, Mohg may have been able to quell the threat of rot altogether, but in doing so he would have needed to kill Malenia and spread his accursed blood across the entirety of the Lands Between. Or maybe he would have just needed Miquella to wake up. As some of you eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed, we're reaching the end of this video, and I've barely mentioned Miquella, besides a few comments here and there. To put it frankly, Miquella deserves his own series of videos, and many of you seem to agree, as Miquella got the most votes in the poll that I put up on the community section. Poor Smithing Master Hugh. The next 2, or maybe even 3 videos will likely be on Miquella. The first of those will be a final part to this video. It's simply too important to cover briefly. That video will likely be out in about 2 weeks, as I'm going to need a bit more time to ensure that Miquella is done justice. I'd like to thank Muse again for the art that she made for this channel, and Savonic for the banner that he made. You can find them at Muse_avocado and at Savonic, and you can find me at RageAkari on Twitter. I'd like to implore anybody who's got this far to continue to do their own research and comment your thoughts about this video or any other topic I cover. Your comments have fueled so many of these theories. This game's lore is so subjective, I read as many comments as I physically can, and I'm genuinely so interested to keep that going, so thank you again. But I won't keep you any longer. And as a great man once said,
what a sick way to fight, eh?